29. Roland holstered his gun, laid both hands on the valve wheel, and tried to turn it. It wouldn't budge. That didn't much surprise him, but it presented serious problems. Oy stood by his left boot, looking up anxiously, waiting for Roland to open the door so they could continue the journey to Jake. The gunslinger only wished it was that easy. It wouldn't do to simply stand out here and wait for someone to leave. It might be hours or even days before one of the Greys decided to use this particular exit again. Gasher and his friends might take it into their heads to flay Jake alive while the gunslinger was waiting for it to happen. He leaned his head against the steel but heard nothing. That didn't surprise him either. He had seen doors like this a long time ago. You couldn't shoot out the locks, and you certainly couldn't hear through them. There might be one, there might be two, facing each other, with some dead air space in between. Somewhere, though, there would be a button which would spin the wheel in the middle of the door and release the locks. If Jake could reach that button, all might still be well. Roland understood that he was not a full member of this quartet. He guessed that even Oy was more fully aware than he of the secret life which existed at its heart. He very much doubted that the bumbler had tracked Jake with his nose alone through those tunnels where water ran in polluted streamlets. Nevertheless, he had been able to help Jake when the boy had been trying to cross from his world to this one. He had been able to see, and when Jake had been trying to regain the key he had dropped, he had been able to send a message. He had to be very careful about sending messages this time. At best, the Greys would realize something was up. At worst, Jake might misinterpret what Roland tried to tell him and do something foolish. But if he could see... Roland closed his eyes and bent all his concentration toward Jake. He thought of the boy's eyes and sent his Ka out to find them. At first there was nothing, but at last an image began to form. It was a face framed by long gray-blonde hair. Green eyes gleamed in deep sockets like fire dims in a cave. Roland quickly understood that this was the Tick-Tock man and that he was a descendant of the man who had died in the air carriage. Interesting, but of no practical value in this situation. He tried to look beyond the Tick-Tock man, to see the rest of the room in which Jake was being held, and the people in it. "Jake!" Oy whispered, as if reminding Roland that this was neither the time nor the place to take a nap. "Shh," the gunslinger said, not opening his eyes. But it was no good. He caught only blurs, probably because Jake's concentration was focused so tightly on the Tick-Tock man. Everyone and everything else was little more than a series of gray-shrouded shapes on the edges of Jake's perception. Roland opened his eyes again and pounded his left fist lightly into the open palm of his right hand. He had an idea that he could push harder and see more, but that might make the boy aware of his presence. That would be dangerous. Gasher might smell a rat, and if he didn't, the Tick-Tock man would. He looked up at the narrow ventilator grills, then down at Oy. He had wondered several times just how smart he was. Now it looked as though he was going to find out. Roland reached up with his good left hand, slipped his fingers between the horizontal slats of the ventilator grill closest to the hatchway through which Jake had been taken, and pulled. The grill popped out in a shower of rust and dried moss. The hole behind it was far too small for a man, but not for a billy bumbler. He put the grill down, picked Oy up, and spoke softly into his ear. "Go, see, come back. Do you understand? Don't let them see you, just go and see, and come back." Oy gazed up into his face, saying nothing, not even Jake's name. Roland had no idea if he had understood or not, but wasting time in ponderation would not help matters. He placed Oy in the ventilator shaft. The bumbler sniffed at the crumbles of dried moss, sneezed delicately, then only crouched there with the draft rippling through his long, silky fur, looking doubtfully at Roland with his strange eyes. "Go and see and come back," Roland repeated in a whisper, and Oy disappeared into the shadows, walking silently, claws retracted on the pads of his paws. Roland drew his gun again and did the hardest thing. He waited. Oy returned less than 3 minutes later. Roland lifted him out of the shaft and put him on the floor. Oy looked up at him with his long neck extended. "How many, Oy?" Roland asked. "How many did you see?" For a long moment he thought the bumbler wouldn't do anything except go on staring in his anxious way. Then he lifted his right paw tentatively in the air, extended the claws, and looked at it, as if trying to remember something very difficult. At last he began to tap on the steel floor. 1, 2, 3, 4... A pause. Then 2 more, quick and delicate, the extended claws clicking lightly on the steel. 5, 6... Oy paused a second time, head down, looking like a child lost in the throes of some titanic mental struggle. Then he tapped his claws 1 final time on the steel, looking up at Roland as he did it. "Wake!" 6 grays and Jake. Roland picked Oy up and stroked him. "Good," he murmured into Oy's ear. In truth, he was almost overwhelmed with surprise and gratitude. He had hoped for something, but this careful response was amazing, and he had few doubts about the accuracy of the count. "Good boy." "Oy! Ake?" Yes, Jake. Jake was the problem. Jake to whom he had made a promise he intended to keep. The gunslinger thought deeply in his strange fashion, that combination of dry pragmatism and wild intuition which had probably come from his strange grandmother, Deirdre the Mad, and had kept him alive all these years after his old companions had passed. Now he was depending on it to keep Jake alive, too. He picked Oy up again, knowing Jake might live, but the bumbler was almost certainly going to die. He whispered several simple words into Oy's cocked ear, repeating them over and over. At last he ceased speaking and returned him to the ventilator shaft. "Good boy," he whispered. "Go on now. Get it done. My heart goes with you." "Oy, heart, ache," the bumbler whispered, and then scurried off into the darkness again. Roland waited for all hell to break loose. 30. Ask me a question, Eddie Dean of New York, and it better be a good one. If it's not, you and your woman are going to die no matter where you came from. And, dear God, how did you respond to something like that? The dark red light had gone out. Now the pink one reappeared. "Hurry!" the faint voice of little Blaine urged them. "He's worse than ever before. Hurry or he'll kill you." Eddie was vaguely aware that flocks of disturbed pigeons were still swooping aimlessly through the cradle, and that some of them had smashed headfirst into the pillars and dropped dead on the floor. "What does it want?" Susanna hissed at the speaker, and the voice of little Blaine somewhere behind it. "For God's sake, what does it want?" No reply, and Eddie could feel any period of grace they might have started with slipping away. He thumbed the talk-listen and spoke with frantic vivacity as the sweat trickled down his cheeks and neck. "Ask me a question. So, Blaine, what have you been up to these last few years? I guess you haven't been doing the old southeast run, huh? Any reason why not? Haven't been feeling up to snuff?" No sound but the rustle and flap of the pigeons. In his mind he saw Artis trying to scream as his cheeks melted and his tongue caught fire. He felt the hair on the nape of his neck stirring and clumping together. Fear or gathering electricity? Hurry, he's worse than ever before. "Who built you, anyway?" Eddie asked frantically, thinking if I only knew what the fucking thing wanted. "Want to talk about that? Was it the Greys? Nah, probably the great old ones, right? Or—" He trailed off. Now he could feel Blaine's silence as a physical weight on his skin, like fleshy, groping hands. "What do you want?" he shouted. "Just what in hell do you want to hear?" No answer, but the buttons on the box were glowing an angry dark red again, and Eddie knew their time was almost up. He could hear a low buzzing sound nearby, a sound like an electrical generator, and he didn't believe that sound was just his imagination, no matter how much he wanted to think so. "Blaine!" Susanna shouted suddenly. "Blaine, do you hear me?" No answer, and Eddie felt the air was filling up with electricity as a bowl under a tap fills up with water. He could feel it crackling bitterly in his nose with every breath he took, could feel his fillings buzzing like angry insects. "Blaine, I've got a question, and it is a pretty good one. Listen." She closed her eyes for a moment, fingers rubbing frantically at her temples, and then opened her eyes again. "There is a thing that nothing is, and yet it has a name. 'Tis sometimes tall and sometimes short." She broke off and stared at Eddie with wide, agonized eyes. "Help me, I can't remember how the rest of it goes." Eddie only stared at her as if she had gone mad. What in the name of God was she talking about? Then it came to him, and it made a weirdly perfect sense, and the rest of the riddle clicked into his mind as neatly as the last two pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. He swung toward the speaker again. "It joins our talks, it joins our sport, and plays at every game. What is it? That's our question, Blaine. What is it?" The red light illuminating the command and enter buttons below the diamond of numbers blinked out. There was an endless moment of silence before Blaine spoke again. But Eddie was aware that the feeling of electricity crawling all over his skin was diminishing. "A shadow, of course," the voice of Blaine responded. "An easy one, but not bad. Not bad at all." The voice coming out of the speaker was animated by a thoughtful quality, and something else as well. Pleasure? Longing? Eddie couldn't quite decide, but he did know there was something in that voice that reminded him of little Blaine. He knew something else as well. Susanna had saved their bacon, at least for the time being. He bent down and kissed her cold, sweaty brow. "Do you know any more riddles?" Blaine asked. "Yes, lots," Susanna said at once. "Our companion Jake has a whole book of them." "From the New York place of where?" Blaine asked, and now the tone of his voice was perfectly clear, at least to Eddie. Blaine might be a machine, but Eddie had been a heroin junkie for 6 years, and he knew stone greed when he heard it. "From New York, right," he said. "But Jake has been taken prisoner. A man named Gasher took him." No answer, and then the buttons glowed that faint rosy pink again. "Good so far," the voice of little Blaine whispered, "but you must be careful. He's tricky." The red lights reappeared at once. "Did one of you speak?" Blaine's voice was cold, and Eddie could have sworn it was so suspicious. He looked at Susanna. Susanna looked back with the wide, frightened eyes of a little girl who has heard something unnameable moving slyly beneath the bed. "I cleared my throat, Blaine," Eddie said. He swallowed and armed sweat from his forehead. Shit, tell the truth and shame the devil. I'm scared to death." "That is very wise of you. These riddles of which you speak, are they stupid? I won't have my patience tried with stupid riddles." "Most are smart," Susanna said, but she looked anxiously at Eddie as she said it. "You lie. You don't know the quality of these riddles at all." "How can you say?" "Voice analysis, frictive patterns, and diphthong stress emphasis provide a reliable quotient of truth-untruth. Predictive reliability is 97%, plus or minus 0.5%. The voice fell silent for a moment, and when it spoke again, it did so in a menacing drawl that Eddie found very familiar. It was the voice of Humphrey Bogart. "I suggest you stick to what you know, sweetheart. The last guy that tried shading the truth with me wound up at the bottom of the send in a pair of cement cowboy boots." "Christ," Eddie said. "We walked 400 miles or so to meet the computer version of Rich Little. How can you imitate guys like John Wayne and Humphrey Bogart, Blaine, guys from our world?" "Nothing." "Okay, you don't want to answer that one. How about this one? If a riddle was what you wanted, why didn't you just say so?" Again, there was no answer, but Eddie discovered that he didn't really need one. Blaine liked riddles, so he had asked them one. Susanna had solved it. Eddie guessed that if she had failed to do so, the two of them would now look like a couple of giant economy-sized charcoal briquettes lying on the floor of the Cradle of Lud. "Blaine?" Susanna asked uneasily. There was no answer. "Blaine, are you still there?" "Yes. Tell me another one." "When is a door not a door?" Eddie asked. "When it's ajar. You'll have to do better than that if you really expect me to take you somewhere. Can you do better than that?" "If Roland gets here, I'm sure we can," Susanna said. "Regardless of how good the riddles in Jake's book may be, Roland knows hundreds. He actually studied them as a child." Having said this, she realized she could not conceive of Roland as a child. "Will you take us, Blaine?" "I might," Blaine said, and Eddie was quite sure he heard a dim thread of cruelty running through that voice. "But you'll have to prime the pump to get me going, and my pump primes backward." "Meaning what?" Eddie asked, looking through the bars at the smooth pink line of Blaine's back. But Blaine did not reply to this or any of the other questions they asked. The bright orange lights stayed on, but both Big Blaine and Little Blaine seemed to have gone into hibernation. Eddie, however, knew better. Blaine was awake. Blaine was watching them. Blaine was listening to their frictive patterns and diphthong stress emphasis. He looked at Susanna. "You'll have to prime the pump, but my pump primes backward," he said bleakly. "It's a riddle, isn't it?" "Yes, of course." She looked at the triangular window, so like a half-lidded, mocking eye, and then pulled him close so she could whisper in his ear. "It's totally insane, Eddie. Schizophrenic, paranoid, probably delusional as well." "Tell me about it," he breathed back. "What we've got here is a lunatic genius ghost in the computer monorail that likes riddles and goes faster than the speed of sound. Welcome to the fantasy version of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest." "Do you have any idea what the answer is?" Eddie shook his head. "You?" "A little tickle way back in my mind. False light, probably. I keep thinking about what Roland said. A good riddle is always sensible and always solvable. It's like a magician's trick." "Misdirection." She nodded. "Go fire another shot, Eddie. Let 'em know we're still here." "Yeah. Now, if we could only be sure that they're still there." "Do you think they are, Eddie?" Eddie had started away, and he spoke without stopping or looking back. "I don't know. That's a riddle not even Blaine could answer." 31. "Could I have something to drink?" Jake asked. His voice came out sounding furry and nasal. Both his mouth and the tissues in his abused nose were swelling up. He looked like someone who was gotten the worst of it in a nasty street fight. "Oh, yes," Tick-Tock replied judiciously. "You could. I'd say you certainly could. We have lots to drink, don't we, Copperhead?" "Aye," said a tall, bespectacled man in a white silk shirt and a pair of black silk trousers. He looked like a college professor in a turn-of-the-century Punch cartoon. "No shortage of potables here." The Tick-Tock man, once more seated at ease in his throne-like chair, looked humorously at Jake. "We have wine, beer, ale, and, of course, good old water. Sometimes that's all a body wants, isn't it? Cool, clear, sparkling water. How does that sound, Cully?" Jake's throat, which was also swollen and as dry as sandpaper, prickled painfully. "Sounds good," he whispered. "It's woke my thirsty up, I know that," Tick-Tock said. His lips spread in a smile, his green eyes sparkled. "Bring me a dipper of water, Tilly. I'll be damned if I know what's happened to my manners." Tilly stepped through the hatchway on the far side of the room. It was opposite the one through which Jake and Gasher had entered. Jake watched her go and licked his swollen lips. "Now," Tick-Tock said, returning his gaze to Jake, "you say the American city you came from, this New York, is much like Lud." "Well, not exactly." "But you do recognize some of the machinery," Tick-Tock pressed. "Valves and pumps and such, not to mention the fire dam tubes." "Yes. We call it neon, but it's the same." Tick-Tock reached out toward him. Jake cringed, but Tick-Tock only patted him on the shoulder. Yes, close enough." His eyes gleamed. "And you've heard of computers?" "Sure." But Tilly returned with the dipper and timidly approached the Tick-Tock man's throne. He took it and held it out to Jake. When Jake reached for it, Tick-Tock pulled it back and drank himself. As Jake watched the water trickle from Tick-Tock's mouth and roll down his naked chest, he began to shake. He couldn't help it. The Tick-Tock man looked over the dipper at him as if just remembering that Jake was still there. Behind him, Gasher, Copperhead, Brandon, and Hoots were grinning like schoolyard kids who have just heard an amusing, dirty joke. "Why, I got thinking about how thirsty I was and forgot all about you," Tick-Tock cried. "That's mean as hell, God's damn my eyes. But of course it looked so good. And it is good. Cold, clear." He held the dipper out to Jake. When Jake reached for it, Tick-Tock pulled it back. "First, Cully, tell me what you know about dipolar computers and transitive circuits," he said coldly. "What?" Jake looked toward the ventilator grill, but the golden eyes were still gone. He was beginning to think he had imagined them after all. He shifted his gaze back to the Tick-Tock man, understanding one thing clearly. He wasn't going to get any water. He had been stupid to even dream he might. "What are dipolar computers?" The Tick-Tock man's face contorted with rage. He threw the remainder of the water into Jake's bruised, puffy face. "Don't you play it light with me!" he shrieked. He stripped off the Seiko watch and shook it in front of Jake. "When I asked you if this ran on a dipolar circuit, you said it didn't, so don't tell me you don't know what I'm talking about when you already made it clear that you do." But... Jake couldn't go on. His head was whirling with fear and confusion. He was aware, in some far-off fashion, that he was licking as much water as he could off his lips. "There's 1,000 of those ever-fucking dipolar computers right under the ever-fucking city, maybe 100,000, and the only one that still works don't do a thing except play Watch Me and run those drums. I want those computers. I want them working for me." The Tick-Tock man bolted forward on his throne, seized Jake, shook him back and forth, and then threw him to the floor. Jake struck one of the lamps, knocking it over, and the bulb blew with a hollow coughing sound. Tilly gave a little shriek and stepped backward, her eyes wide and frightened. Copperhead and Brandon looked at each other uneasily. Tick-Tock leaned forward, elbows on his thighs, and screamed into Jake's face, "I want 'em and I mean to have 'em!" Silence fell in the room, broken only by the soft whoosh of warm air pouring from the ventilators. Then the twisted rage on the Tick-Tock man's face disappeared so suddenly it might never have existed at all. It was replaced by another charming smile. He leaned further forward and helped Jake to his feet. "Sorry. I get thinking about the potential of this place, and sometimes I get carried away. Please accept my apology, Cully." He picked up the overturned dipper and threw it at Tilly. "Fill this up, you useless bitch. What's the matter with you?" He turned his attention back to Jake, still smiling his TV game show host smile. "All right. You've had your little joke, and I've had mine. Now tell me everything you know about dipolar computers and transitive circuits, then you can have a drink." Jake opened his mouth to say something, he had no idea what. And then, incredibly, Roland's voice was in his mind, filling it. "Distract them, Jake, and if there's a button that opens the door, get close to it." The Tick-Tock man was watching him closely. "Something just came into your mind, didn't it, Cully? I always know, so don't keep it a secret. Tell your old friend Ticky." Jake caught movement in the corner of his eye. Although he did not dare glance up at the ventilator panel, not with all the Tick-Tock man's notice bent upon him, he knew that Oy was back, peering down through the louvers. Distract them. And suddenly Jake knew just how to do that. "I did think of something," he said, "but it wasn't about computers. It was about my old pal Gasher and his old pal Hoots." "Here, here," Gasher cried. "What are you talking about, boy?" "Why don't you tell Tick-Tock who really gave you the password, Gasher? Then I can tell Tick-Tock where you keep it." The Tick-Tock man's puzzled gaze shifted from Jake to Gasher. "What's he talking about?" "Nothing," Gasher said, but he could not forbear a quick glance at Hoots. "He's just running his gob, trying to get off the hot seat by putting me on it, Ticky. I told you he was pert. Didn't I say?" "Take a look in his scarf, why don't you?" Jake asked. "He's got a scrap of paper with the word written on it. I had to read it to him because he couldn't even do that." There was no sudden rage on Tick-Tock's part this time. His face darkened gradually instead, like a summer sky before a terrible thunderstorm. "Let me see your scarf, Gasher," he said in a soft, thick voice. "Let your old pal sneak a peek." "He's lying, I tell you," Gasher cried, putting his hands on his scarf and taking 2 steps backward toward the wall. Directly above him, Oi's gold-ringed eyes gleamed. "All you got to do is look in his face to see the lines what a pert little cut like him does best." The Tick-Tock man shifted his gaze to Hoots, who looked sick with fear. "What about it?" Tick-Tock asked in his soft, terrible voice. "What about it, Hooter man? I know you and Gasher was butt buddies of old, and I know you've the brains of a hung goose, but surely not even you could be stupid enough to write down a password to the inner chamber. Could you? Could you?" I only thought," Hoots began. "Shut up!" Gasher shouted. He shot Jake a look of pure, sick hate. "I'll kill you for this, dearie. See if I don't." "Take off your scarf, Gasher," the Tick-Tock man said. "I want to look inside it." Jake sidled a step closer to the podium with the buttons on it. "No!" Gasher's hands returned to the scarf and pressed against it as if it might fly away of its own accord. "Be damned if I will!" "Brandon, grab him," Tick-Tock said. Brandon lunged for Gasher. Gasher's move wasn't as quick as Tick-Tock's had been, but it was quick enough. He bent, yanked a knife from the top of his boot, and buried it in Brandon's arm. "Oh, you bastard!" Brandon shouted in surprise and pain as blood began to pour out of his arm. "Look at what you did!" Tilly screamed. "Do I have to do everything around here myself?" Tick-Tock shouted, more exasperated than angry, it seemed, and rose to his feet. Gasher retreated from him, weaving the bloody knife back and forth in front of his face in mystic patterns. He kept his other hand planted firmly on top of his head. "Draw back," he panted. "I love you like a brother, Ticky, but if you don't draw back, I'll hide this blade in your guts, so I will." "You? Not likely," the Tick-Tock man said with a laugh. He removed his own knife from its scabbard and held it delicately by the bone hilt. All eyes were on the 2 of them. Jake took 2 quick steps to the podium with its little cluster of buttons and reached for the one he thought the Tick-Tock man had pushed. Gasher was backing along the curved wall, the tubes of light painting his mandrus-riddled face in a succession of sick colors, bile green, fever red, jaundice yellow. Now it was the Tick-Tock man standing below the ventilator grill where Oi was watching. "Put it down, Gasher," Tick-Tock said in a reasonable tone of voice. "You brought the boy as I asked. If anyone else gets pricked over this, it'll be Hoots, not you. Just show me Jake saw Oi crouching to spring and understood 2 things, what the bumbler meant to do and who had put him up to it." "Oi, no!" he screamed. All of them turned to look at him. At that moment, Oi leaped, hitting the flimsy ventilator grill and knocking it free. The Tick-Tock man wheeled toward the sound, and Oi fell onto his upturned face, biting and slashing. 32. Roland heard it faintly, even through the twin doors. "Oi, no!" and his heart sank. He waited for the valve wheel to turn, but it did not. He closed his eyes and sent with all his might, "The door, Jake! Open the door!" He sensed no response, and the pictures were gone. His communication line with Jake, flimsy to begin with, had now been severed. 33. The Tick-Tock man blundered backward, cursing and screaming and grabbing at the writhing, biting, digging thing on his face. He felt Oi's claws punch into his left eye, popping it, and a horrible red pain sank into his head like a flaming torch thrown down a deep well. At that point, rage overwhelmed pain. He seized Oi, tore him off his face, and held him over his head, meaning to twist him like a rag. "No!" Jake wailed. He forgot about the button which unlocked the doors and seized the gun hanging from the back of the chair. Tilly shrieked. The others scattered. Jake leveled the old German machine gun at the Tick-Tock man. Oi, upside down in those huge, strong hands and bent almost to the snapping point, writhed madly and slashed his teeth into the air. He shrieked in agony, a horribly human sound. "Leave him alone, you bastard!" Jake screamed and pressed the trigger. He had enough presence of mind left to aim low. The roar of the Schmeiser 40 was ear-splitting in the enclosed space, although it fired only 5 or 6 rounds. One of the lighted tubes popped in a burst of cold orange fire. A hole appeared an inch above the left knee of the Tick-Tock man's tight-fitting trousers, and a dark red stain began to spread at once. Tick-Tock's mouth opened in a shocked O of surprise, an expression which said more clearly than words could have done that for all his intelligence, Tick-Tock had expected to live a long, happy life where he shot people but was never shot himself. Shot at, perhaps, but actually hit? That surprised expression said that just wasn't supposed to be in the cards. "Welcome to the real world, you fuck," Jake thought. Tick-Tock dropped Oi to the iron grillwork floor to grab at his wounded leg. Copperhead lunged at Jake, got an arm around his throat, and then Oi was on him, barking shrilly and chewing at Copperhead's ankle through the black silk pants. Copperhead screamed and danced away, shaking Oi back and forth at the end of his leg. Oi clung like a limpet. Jake turned to see the Tick-Tock man crawling toward him. He had retrieved his knife, and the blade was now clamped between his teeth. "Goodbye, Ticky," Jake said, and pressed the Schmeizer's trigger again. Nothing happened. Jake didn't know if it was empty or jammed, and this was hardly the time to speculate. He took 2 steps backward before finding further retreat blocked by the big chair which had served the Tick-Tock man as a throne. Before he could slip around, putting the chair between them, Tick-Tock had grabbed his ankle. His other hand went to the hilt of his knife. The ruins of his left eye lay on his cheek like a glob of mint jelly. The right eye glared up at Jake with insane hatred. Jake tried to pull away from the clutching hand and went sprawling on the Tick-Tock man's throne. His eye fell on a pocket which had been sewn into the right-hand armrest. Jutting from the elasticized top was the cracked pearl handle of a revolver. "Oh, golly, how you'll suffer," the Tick-Tock man whispered ecstatically. The O of surprise had been replaced by a wide, trembling grin. "Oh, how you'll suffer, and how happy I'll be to—" "What?" The grin slackened, and the surprised O began to reappear as Jake pointed the cheesy, nickel-plated revolver at him and thumbed back the hammer. The grip on Jake's ankle tightened until it seemed to him that the bones there must snap. "You dasn't!" Tick-Tock said in a screamy whisper. "Yes, I do," Jake said grimly, and pulled the trigger of the Tick-Tock man's run-out gun. There was a flat crack, much less dramatic than the Schmeizer's Teutonic roar. A small black hole appeared high up on the right side of Tick-Tock's forehead. The Tick-Tock man went on staring up at Jake, disbelief in his remaining eye. Jake tried to make himself shoot him again and couldn't do it. Suddenly a flap of the Tick-Tock man's scalp peeled away like old wallpaper and dropped on his right cheek. Roland would have known what this meant. Jake, however, was now almost beyond coherent thought. A dark, panicky horror was spinning across his mind like a tornado funnel. He cringed back in the big chair as the hand on his ankle fell away and the Tick-Tock man collapsed forward on his face. The door! He had to open the door and let the gunslinger in. Focusing on that and nothing but, Jake let the pearl-handled revolver clatter to the iron grating and pushed himself out of the chair. He was reaching again for the button he thought he had seen Tick-Tock push when a pair of hands settled around his throat and dragged him backward, away from the podium. "I said I'd kill you for it, my nasty little pal," a voice whispered in his ear, "and the Gasher man always keeps his promises." Jake flailed behind him with both hands and found nothing but thin air. Gasher's fingers sank into his throat, choking relentlessly. The world started to turn gray in front of his eyes. Gray quickly deepened to purple, and purple to black. 34. A pump started up, and the valve wheel in the center of the hatch spun rapidly. Gods be thanked, Roland thought. He seized the wheel with his right hand almost before it had stopped moving and yanked it open. The other door was ajar. From beyond it came the sounds of men fighting and Oi's bark, now shrill with pain and fury. Roland kicked the door open with his boot and saw Gasher throttling Jake. Oi had left Copperhead and was now trying to make Gasher let go of Jake, but Gasher's boot was doing double duty, protecting its owner from the bumbler's teeth and protecting Oi from the virulent infection which ran in Gasher's blood. Brandon stabbed Oi in the flank again in an effort to make him stop worrying Gasher's ankle, but Oi paid no heed. Jake hung from his captor's dirty hands like a puppet whose strings have been cut. His face was bluish-white, his swollen lips a delicate shade of lavender. Gasher looked up. "You!" he snarled. "Me," Roland agreed. He fired once, and the left side of Gasher's head disintegrated. The man went flying backward, blood-stained yellow scarf unraveling, and landed on top of the Tick-Tock man. His feet drummed spastically on the iron grillwork for a moment, and then fell still. The gunslinger shot Brandon twice, fanning the hammer of his revolver with the flat of his right hand. Brandon, who had been bent over Oy for another stroke, spun around, struck the wall, and slid slowly down it, clutching at one of the tubes. Green swamp-light spilled out from between his loosening fingers. Oy limped to where Jake lay and began licking his pale, still face. Copperhead and Hoots had seen enough. They ran side by side for the small door through which Tilly had gone to get the dipper of water. It was the wrong time for chivalry. Roland shot them both in the back. He would have to move fast now, very fast indeed, and he would not risk being waylaid by these two if they should chance to rediscover their guts. A cluster of bright orange lights came on at the top of the capsule-shaped enclosure, and an alarm began to go off, in broad, hoarse blats that battered the walls. After a moment or two, the emergency lights began to pulse in sync with the alarm. 35. Eddie was returning to Susanna when the alarm began to wail. He yelled in surprise and raised the Ruger, pointing it at nothing. "What's happening?" Susanna shook her head. She had no idea. The alarm was scary, but that was only part of the problem. It was also loud enough to be physically painful. Those amplified jags of sound made Eddie think of a tractor-trailer horn raised to the 10th power. At that moment, the orange arc sodiums began to pulse. When he reached Susanna's chair, Eddie saw that the command and enter buttons were also pulsing in bright red beats. They looked like winking eyes. "Blaine, what's happening?" he shouted. He looked around, but saw only wildly jumping shadows. "Are you doing this?" Blaine's only response was laughter, terrible mechanical laughter that made Eddie think of the clockwork clown that had stood outside the House of Horrors at Coney Island when he was a little kid. "Blaine, stop it!" Susanna shrieked. "How can we think of an answer to your riddle with that air raid siren going off?" The laughter stopped as suddenly as it began, but Blaine made no reply. Or perhaps he did. From beyond the bars that separated them from the platform, huge engines powered by frictionless slow-trans turbines awoke at the command of the dipolar computers the Tick-Tock man had so lusted after. For the first time in a decade, Blaine the Mono was awake and cycling up toward running speed. 36. The alarm, which had indeed been built to warn Ludd's long-dead residents of an impending air attack, and which had not even been tested in almost 1,000 years, blanketed the city with sound. All the lights which still operated came on and began to pulse in sync. Pubes above the streets and greys below them were alike convinced that the end they had always feared was finally upon them. The greys suspected some cataclysmic mechanical breakdown was occurring. The pubes, who had always believed that the ghosts lurking in the machines below the city would someday rise up to take their long-delayed vengeance on the still living, were probably closer to the actual truth of what was happening. Certainly there had been an intelligence left in the ancient computers below the city, a single living organism which had long ago ceased to exist sanely under conditions that within its merciless dipolar circuits could only be absolute reality. It had held its increasingly alien logic within its banks of memory for 800 years, and might have held them for 800 more, if not for the arrival of Roland and his friends. Yet this mens non corpus had brooded and grown ever more insane with each passing year. Even in its increasing periods of sleep it could be said to dream, and these dreams grew steadily more abnormal as the world moved on. Now, although the unthinkable machinery which maintained the beams had weakened, this insane and inhuman intelligence had awakened in the rooms of ruin, and had begun once more, although as bodiless as any ghost, to stumble through the halls of the dead. In other words, Blaine the Mono was preparing to get out of Dodge. 37. Roland heard a footstep behind him as he knelt by Jake and turned, raising his gun. Tilly, her dough-colored face a mask of confusion and superstitious fear, raised her hands and shrieked, "Don't kill me, sire! Please, don't kill me!" "Run, then," Roland said curtly, and as Tilly began to move, he struck her calf with the barrel of his revolver. "Not that way. Through the door I came in, and if you ever see me again, I'll be the last thing you ever see. Now go." She disappeared into the leaping, circling shadows. Roland dropped his head to Jake's chest, slamming his palm against his other ear to deaden the pulse of the alarm. He heard the boy's heartbeat, slow but strong. He slipped his arms around the boy, and as he did, Jake's eyes fluttered open. "You didn't let me fall this time." His voice was no more than a hoarse whisper. "No, not this time and not ever again. Don't try your voice." "Where's Oi?" "Oi!" the bumbler barked. "Oi!" Brandon had slashed Oi several times, but none of the wounds seemed mortal or even serious. It was clear that he was in some pain, but it was equally clear he was transported with joy. He regarded Jake with sparkling eyes, his pink tongue lolling out. "Hey, Jake! Jake!" Jake burst into tears and reached for him. Oi limped into the circle of his arms and allowed himself to be hugged for a moment. Roland got up and looked around, his gaze fixed on the door on the far side of the room. The two men he'd backshot had been heading in that direction, and the woman had also wanted to go that way. The gunslinger went toward the door with Jake in his arms and Oi at his heel. He kicked one of the dead greys aside and ducked through. The room beyond was a kitchen. It managed to look like a hog wallow. In spite of the built-in appliances and the stainless steel walls, the greys were apparently not much interested in housekeeping. "Drink," Jake whispered. "Please, so thirsty." Roland felt a queer doubling, as if time had folded backward on itself. He remembered lurching out of the desert, crazy with the heat and the emptiness. He remembered passing out in the stable of the way station, half dead from thirst, and waking at the taste of cool water trickling down his throat. The boy had taken off his shirt, soaked it under the flow from the pump, and given him to drink. Now it was his turn to do for Jake what Jake had already done for him. Roland glanced around and saw a sink. He went over to it and turned on the faucet. Cold, clear water rushed out. Over them, around them, under them, the alarm roared on and on. "Can you stand?" Jake nodded. "I think so." Roland set the boy on his feet, ready to catch him if he looked too wobbly, but Jake hung on to the sink, then ducked his head beneath the flowing water. Roland picked Oi up and looked at his wounds. They were already clotting. "You got off very lucky, my furry friend," Roland thought, then reached past Jake to cup a palmful of water for the animal. Oi drank it eagerly. Jake drew back from the faucet with his hair plastered to the sides of his face. His skin was still too pale, and the signs that he had been badly beaten were clearly visible, but he looked better than he had when Roland had first bent over him. For one terrible moment, the gunslinger had been positive Jake was dead. He found himself wishing he could go back and kill Gasher again, and that led him to another thought. What about the one Gasher called the Tick-Tock Man? Did you see him, Jake? "Yes. Oi ambushed him, tore up his face, then I shot him." "Dead?" Jake's lips began to tremble. He pressed them firmly together. "Yes, in his—" He tapped his forehead high above his right eyebrow. I was lucky." Roland looked at him appraisingly, then slowly shook his head. "You know, I doubt that. But never mind now. Come on." "Where are we going?" Jake's voice was still little more than a husky murmur, and he kept looking past Roland's shoulder toward the room where he had almost died. Roland pointed across the kitchen. Beyond another hatchway, the corridor continued. "That'll do for a start." "Gunslinger!" a voice boomed from everywhere. Roland wheeled around, one arm cradling Oi and the other around Jake's shoulders, but there was no one to see. "Who speaks to me?" he shouted. "Name yourself, gunslinger." "Roland of Gilead, son of Stephen, who speaks to me?" "Gilead is no more," the voice mused, ignoring the question. Roland looked up and saw patterns of concentric rings in the ceiling. The voice was coming from those. No gunslinger has walked in-world or mid-world for almost 300 years. I and my friends are the last. Jake took Oi from Roland. The bumbler at once began to lick the boy's swollen face. His gold-ringed eyes were full of adoration and happiness. "It's Blaine," Jake whispered to Roland, "isn't it?" Roland nodded. Of course it was. But he had an idea that there was a great deal more to Blaine than just a monorail train. "Boy, are you Jake of New York?" Jake pressed closer to Roland and looked up at the speakers. "Yes," he said, "that's me, Jake of New York, son of Elmer. Do you still have the Book of Riddles, the one of which I have been told?" Jake reached over his shoulder, and an expression of dismayed recollection filled his face as his fingers touched nothing but his own back. When he looked at Roland again, the gunslinger was holding his pack out toward him, and although the man's narrow, finely carved face was as expressionless as ever, Jake sensed the ghost of a smile lurking at the corners of his mouth. "You'll have to fix the straps," Roland said as Jake took the pack. "I made them longer." "But Riddle-de-Dum?" Roland nodded. "Both books are still in there." "What you got, little pilgrim?" the voice inquired in a leisurely drawl. "Cripes," Jake said. "It can see us as well as hear us," Roland thought. And a moment later he spotted a small glass eye in one corner, far above a man's normal line of sight. He felt a chill slip over his skin and knew from both the troubled look on Jake's face and the way the boy's arms had tightened around Oi that he wasn't alone in his unease. That voice belonged to a machine, an incredibly smart machine, a playful machine, but there was something very wrong with it all the same. "The book?" Jake said. "I've got the riddle book." "Good." There was an almost human satisfaction in the voice. "Really excellent." A scruffy, bearded fellow suddenly appeared in the doorway on the far side of the kitchen. A blood-stained, dirt-streaked yellow scarf flapped from the newcomer's upper arm. "Fire's in the walls!" he screamed. In his panic, he seemed not to realize that Roland and Jake were not part of his miserable subterranean quartet. "Smoke on the lower levels, people killing themselves. Something's gone wrong. Hell, everything's gone wrong. We gotta—" The door of the oven suddenly dropped open like an unhinged jaw. A thick beam of blue-white fire shot out and engulfed the scruffy man's head. He was driven backward with his clothes in flames and his skin boiling on his face. Jake stared up at Roland, stunned and horrified. Roland put an arm about the boy's shoulders. "He interrupted me," the voice said. "That was rude, wasn't it?" "Yes," Roland said calmly. "Extremely rude." "Susanna of New York says you have a great many riddles by heart, Roland of Gilead. Is this true?" "Yes." There was an explosion in one of the rooms opening off this arm of the corridor. The floor shuddered beneath their feet, and voices screamed in a jagged chorus. The pulsing lights and the endless blatting siren faded momentarily, then came back strong. A little skein of bitter, acrid smoke drifted from the ventilators. Oi got a whiff and sneezed. "Tell me one of your riddles, gunslinger," the voice invited. It was serene and untroubled, as if they were all sitting together in a peaceful village square somewhere, instead of beneath a city that seemed on the verge of ripping itself apart. Roland thought for a moment, and what came to mind was Cuthbert's favorite riddle. "All right, Blaine," he said, "I will. What's better than all the gods and worse than Old Man Splitfoot? Dead people eat it always, live people who eat it die slow." There was a long pause. Jake put his face in Oi's fur to try to get away from the stink of the roasted gray. "Be careful, gunslinger." The voice was as small as a cool puff of breeze on summer's hottest day. The voice of the machine had come from all the speakers, but this one came only from the speaker directly overhead. "Be careful, Jake of New York. Remember that these are the drawers. Go slow and be very careful." Jake looked at the gunslinger with widening eyes. Roland gave his head a small, faint shake and raised one finger. He looked as if he was scratching the side of his nose, but that finger also lay across his lips, and Jake had an idea Roland was actually telling him to keep his mouth shut. "A clever riddle," Blaine said at last. There seemed to be real admiration in its voice. "The answer is nothing, is it not?" "That's right," Roland said. "You're pretty clever yourself, Blaine." When the voice spoke again, Roland heard what Eddie had heard already, a deep and ungovernable greed. "Ask me another." Roland drew a deep breath. "Not just now. I hope you are not refusing me, Roland, son of Stephen, for that is also rude, extremely rude." "Take us to our friends and help us get out of Lud," Roland said. "Then there may be time for riddling." "I could kill you where you stand," the voice said, and now it was as cold as winter's darkest day. "Yes," Roland said, "I'm sure you could, but the riddles would die with us." "I could take the boy's book." "Thieving is ruder than either refusal or interruption," Roland remarked. He spoke as if merely passing the time of day, but the remaining fingers of his right hand were tight on Jake's shoulder. "Besides," Jake said, looking up at the speaker in the ceiling, "the answers aren't in the book. Those pages were torn out." In a flash of inspiration, he tapped his temple. "They're up here, though." "You fellows want to remember that nobody loves a smart-ass," Blaine said. There was another explosion, this one louder and closer. One of the ventilator grills blew off and shot across the kitchen like a projectile. A moment later, 2 men and a woman emerged through the door which led to the rest of the Greys' warren. The gunslinger leveled his revolver at them, then lowered it as they stumbled across the kitchen and into the silo beyond without so much as a look at Roland and Jake. To Roland they looked like animals fleeing before a forest fire. A stainless steel panel in the ceiling slid open, revealing a square of darkness. Something silvery flashed within it, and a few moments later a steel sphere, perhaps a foot in diameter, dropped from the hole and hung in the air of the kitchen. "Follow," Blaine said flatly. "Will it take us to Eddie and Susanna?" Jake asked hopefully. Blaine replied only with silence, but when the sphere began floating down the corridor, Roland and Jake followed it. 38. Jake had no clear memory of the time which followed, and that was probably merciful. He had left his world over a year before 900 people would commit suicide together in a small South American country called Guyana. But he knew about the periodic death rushes of the lemmings, and what was happening in the disintegrating undercity of the Greys was like that. There were explosions, some on their level, but most far below them. Acrid smoke occasionally drifted from the ventilator grills, but most of the air purifiers were still working, and they whipped the worst of it away before it could gather in choking clouds. They saw no fires. Yet the Greys were reacting as if the time of the apocalypse had come. Most only fled, their faces blank O's of panic, but many had committed suicide in the halls and interconnected rooms through which the steel sphere led Roland and Jake. Some had shot themselves, many more had slashed their throats or wrists, a few appeared to have swallowed poison. On all the faces of the dead was the same expression of overmastering terror. Jake could only vaguely understand what had driven them to this. Roland had a better idea of what had happened to them, to their minds, when the long-dead city first came to life around them and then seemed to commence tearing itself apart. And it was Roland who understood that Blaine was doing it on purpose, that Blaine was driving them to it. They ducked around a man hanging from an overhead heating duct and pounded down a flight of steel stairs behind the floating steel ball. "Jake," Roland shouted, "you never let me in at all, did you?" Jake shook his head. "I didn't think so. It was Blaine." They reached the bottom of the stairs and hurried along a narrow corridor toward a hatch with the words "Absolutely No Admittance" printed on it in the spiked letters of the high speech. "Is it Blaine?" Jake asked. "Yes, that's as good a name as any." "What about the other Hush," Roland said grimly. The steel ball paused in front of the hatchway. The wheels spun and the hatch popped ajar. Roland pulled it open, and they stepped into a huge underground room which stretched away in 3 directions as far as they could see. It was filled with seemingly endless aisles of control panels and electronic equipment. Most of the panels were still dark and dead, but as Jake and Roland stood inside the door looking about with wide eyes, they could see pilot lights coming on and hear machinery cycling up. "The Tick-Tock man said there were thousands of computers," Jake said. "I guess he was right. My God, look!" Roland did not understand the word Jake had used, and so said nothing. He only watched as row after row of panels lit up. A cloud of sparks and a momentary tongue of green fire jumped from one of the consoles as some ancient piece of equipment malfunctioned. Most of the machinery, however, appeared to be up and running just fine. Needles which hadn't moved in centuries suddenly jumped into the green. Huge aluminum cylinders spun, spilling data stored on silicone chips into memory banks which were once more wide awake and ready for input. Digital displays indicating everything from the mean aquifer water pressure in the West River Barony to available power amperage in the hibernating Send Basin nuclear plant lit up in brilliant dot matrices of red and green. Overhead, banks of hanging globes began to flash on, radiating outward in spokes of light. And from below, above, and around them, from everywhere, came the deep bass hum of generators and slow-trans engines awakening from their long sleep. Jake had begun to flag badly. Roland swept him into his arms again and chased the steel ball past machines at whose function and intent he could not even guess. Oy ran at his heels. The ball banked left, and the aisle in which they now found themselves ran between banks of TV monitors, thousands of them, stacked in rows like a child's building blocks. "My dad would love it," Jake thought. Some sections of this vast video arcade were still dark, but many of the screens were on. They showed a city in chaos, both above and below. Clumps of pubes surged pointlessly through the streets, eyes wide, mouths moving soundlessly. Many were leaping from the tall buildings. Jake observed with horror that hundreds more had congregated at the Seine Bridge and were throwing themselves into the river. Other screens showed large cot-filled rooms like dormitories. Some of these rooms were on fire, but the panic-stricken Greys seemed to be setting the fires themselves, torching their own mattresses and furniture for God alone knew what reason. One screen showed a barrel-chested giant tossing men and women into what looked like a blood-spattered stamping press. This was bad enough, but there was something worse. The victims were standing in an unguarded line, docilely waiting their turns. The executioner, his yellow scarf pulled tight over his skull and the knotted ends swinging below his ears like pigtails, seized an old woman and held her up, waiting patiently for the stainless steel block of metal to clear the killing floor so he could toss her in. The old woman did not struggle, seemed in fact to be smiling. "In the rooms the people come and go," Blaine said. "But I don't think any of them are talking of Michelangelo." He suddenly laughed, strange, tittery laughter that sounded like rats scampering over broken glass. The sound sent chills chasing up Jake's neck. He wanted nothing at all to do with an intelligence that laughed like that. But what choice did they have? He turned his gaze helplessly back to the monitors, and Roland at once turned his head away. He did this gently but firmly. "There's nothing there you need to look at, Jake," he said. "But why are they doing it?" Jake asked. He had eaten nothing all day, but he still felt like vomiting. "Why?" "Because they're frightened, and Blaine is feeding their fear. But mostly, I think, because they've lived too long in the graveyard of their grandfathers, and they're tired of it. And before you pity them, remember how happy they would have been to take you along with them into the clearing where the path ends." The steel ball zipped around another corner, leaving the TV screens and electronic monitoring equipment behind. Ahead, a wide ribbon of some synthetic stuff was set into the floor. It gleamed like fresh tar between two narrow strips of chrome steel that dwindled to a point on what was not the far side of this room, but its horizon. The ball bounced impatiently above the dark strip, and suddenly the belt, for that was what it was, swept into silent motion, trundling along between its steel facings at jogging speed. The ball made small arcs in the air, urging them to climb on. Roland trotted beside the moving strip until he was roughly matching its speed, then did just that. He set Jake down, and the three of them, Gunslinger, Boy, and Golden-Eyed Bumbler, were carried rapidly across this shadowy underground plain where the ancient machines were awakening. The moving strip carried them into an area of what looked like filing cabinets, row after endless row of them. They were dark, but not dead. A low, sleepy humming sound came from within them, and Jake could see hairline cracks of bright yellow light shining between the steel panels. He suddenly found himself thinking of the Tick-Tock man. "There's maybe 100,000 of those ever-fucking dipolar computers under the ever-fucking city. I want those computers." "Well," Jake thought, "they're waking up, so I guess you're getting what you wanted, Ticky. But if you were here, I'm not sure you'd still want it." Then he remembered Tick-Tock's great-grandfather, who'd been brave enough to climb into an airplane from another world and take it into the sky. With that kind of blood running in his veins, Jake supposed, Tick-Tock, far from being frightened to the point of suicide, would have been delighted by this turn of events, and the more people who killed themselves in terror, the happier he would have been. "Too late now, Ticky," he thought, "thank God." Roland spoke in a soft, wondering voice. "All these boxes. I think we're riding through the mind of the thing that calls itself Blaine, Jake. I think we're riding through its mind." Jake nodded and found himself thinking of his final essay. "Blaine the brain is a hell of a pain." "Yes." Jake looked closely at Roland. "Are we going to come out where I think we're going to come out?" "Yes," Roland said. "If we're still following the path of the beam, we'll come out in the cradle." Jake nodded. "Roland?" "What?" "Thanks for coming after me." Roland nodded and put an arm around Jake's shoulders. Far ahead of them, huge motors rumbled to life. A moment later, a heavy grinding sound began, and new light, the harsh glow of orange arc sodiums, flooded down on them. Jake could now see the place where the moving belt stopped. Beyond it was a steep, narrow escalator leading up into that orange light.